Welcome to Yellowstone Story. Every story holds a lesson, a twist, or a spark of inspiration. Here, we dive into gripping tales, some heartwarming, some shocking, but all unforgettable. So sit back, relax, and let's begin. I watched as his car slowly pulled out of the driveway. Only when its red taillights disappeared around the corner did I allow myself to move. There was no more time to wait. Stepping into my son's room, I saw his tear-streaked face. He sat on the bed, clutching his favorite toy in his hands. There was no time for explanations, but he understood immediately. He always grasped things faster than he should for his age. I hurriedly packed a bag with the few essentials we could take: documents, some clothes, anything that might be useful on the road. I left my phone behind. If he wanted to find us, that would be the first thing he'd track. I had no money. I had never had access to our finances. He controlled everything. He never allowed me to work either. "Your duty is to take care of the house, raise our son, and be a good wife," he would say, as if I were his personal possession. And for so long, I convinced myself that this was how it was supposed to be. The silence between us grew heavy with tension. He waited, his gaze expectant, making it clear that he wanted an answer. There was no point in hiding the truth, and lying felt too dangerous. I began to speak, hesitantly at first, my hands clenched tightly, but soon the words came faster. It had been too long since I had let them out. I didn't sugarcoat anything. I laid it all bare: the constant humiliation, the fear, the way escape had always seemed impossible. When I finished, silence settled between us once again. He had listened without interruption, without judgment. Then, in a low voice, he acknowledged what was now obvious: we had nowhere else to go. I told him we would leave in the morning, but he just shook his head slightly, as if he already knew it wouldn't be that simple. Every so often, his gaze lingered on me just a little longer, as if he were thinking something over. Maybe he found it strange that we had chosen to hide in this place of all places. Or maybe he was just trying to gauge how far I was willing to go to keep my son safe. Finally, signaling that the conversation was over, he turned toward the door. Just as he was about to leave, he hesitated, then handed me an old but warm blanket. He mentioned that the nights could get cold and that I should make sure my son stayed warm. I took it in silence, my fingers gripping the fabric as I returned to Aiden's side. For the first time in a long while, something unfamiliar settled inside me, something that almost felt like safety. The figure in the doorway was tall and broad, with a thick beard and unkempt hair. His gaze was heavy, cautious, but not overtly hostile. His eyes flickered toward Aiden, still sleeping, before he gestured for me to follow him into the kitchen. Fear tightened around me, making my movements sluggish. I glanced at my son one last time before stepping forward, feeling as though I were walking toward my own execution. The man noticed my hesitation, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. He pulled the door to the kitchen almost closed, leaving just enough of a gap for me to keep an eye on Aiden. The silence between us grew thick with tension. He watched me expectantly, waiting for an answer. There was no point in hiding the truth, and lying felt dangerous. I began to speak, hesitantly at first, my fingers gripping each other tightly. But as the words spilled out, they grew faster, heavier. It had been too long since I had let them go. I didn't soften anything. I laid out the raw truth. The endless humiliation, the fear, the feeling of being trapped with no escape. When I finished, silence filled the space between us. He had listened without interruption, without judgment. Finally, he simply acknowledged what was clear: we had nowhere else to go. I told him we would leave in the morning, but he only shook his head slightly, as if he already knew it wouldn't be that easy. His gaze lingered on me a little longer than before, as though he were weighing something in his mind. Maybe he found it strange that we had chosen to hide here, of all places. Or maybe he was just trying to figure out how far I was willing to go to keep my son safe. Finally, signaling the conversation was over, he turned toward the door. But just as he was about to leave, he hesitated, then handed me an old but warm blanket. He mentioned the nights could get cold and that I should keep my son warm. I took it without a word and returned to Aiden's side. For the first time in a long while, something unfamiliar settled inside me, something that almost felt like safety. The blanket was warm and soft. I instinctively pressed it against myself for a moment, before gently covering Aiden with it. The tension that had gripped me all evening slowly began to fade. The fear didn't just disappear, it left something unexpected in its place. Not just relief, but a faint sense of security, something I had long forgotten how to feel. I woke late the next morning, sunlight pouring into the room. But the moment my mind cleared, I realized Aiden was no longer beside me. Panic surged through me, my body reacting before my thoughts could catch up. I rushed toward the door, my breath shallow, but just as I stepped outside, I saw him. Aiden stood in the yard, surrounded by neatly cut rows of grass, animatedly telling something to Dan, his hands moving as he spoke. The man listened, responding in a calm, steady tone while continuing his work, as if their conversation was the most natural thing in the world. There was no awkwardness, no hesitation, just an easy familiarity, as if they had known each other for years. Stepping onto the porch, I caught their attention. They both turned to look at me. Aiden beamed at me, eager to share his excitement, talking about fishing, about some plan I hadn't heard of. It all sounded so easy, so natural, as if staying here was a real possibility. But it wasn't. I watched him, trying to find the right words, but an unsettling thought crept in. Maybe, for the first time in a long while, he actually felt happy. Dan mentioned, in his usual calm manner, that they had already had breakfast but wouldn't mind some tea. I found myself smiling without thinking. Something about the conversation felt lighter, easier, so different from the constant weight of fear I had carried for so long. The offer to make not just breakfast but lunch as well slipped out without hesitation. If we were going to be here a little longer, I might as well be useful. Dan nodded in agreement, and we all headed inside. As I busied myself in the kitchen, humming softly, Aiden stayed outside with Dan. When I finally stepped back out, I couldn't hide my surprise. The overgrown yard, which had seemed abandoned just the day before, was now neat and cleared. The grass had been cut, the scattered debris removed. The space around the house no longer felt forgotten. It looked cared for. Dan caught my expression and, almost reluctantly, explained that the overgrown grass wasn't safe for a child. He mentioned snakes, how Aiden needed space to run and play. Then, without another word, he disappeared into the shed and returned with a soccer ball. Aiden grabbed the ball with excitement, his eyes lighting up as if he had just been given the greatest gift in the world. Dan, still smiling, casually suggested building a goal for him. Watching my son so happy, so carefree, felt foreign, like witnessing something I had almost forgotten could exist. The day slipped by quickly. By evening, Aiden, exhausted from playing, fell asleep the moment his head hit the pillow. I stayed behind in the kitchen, where Dan had already brewed tea. For the first time, I found myself wanting to ask about him. He didn't dodge the question. His story, as he put it, was just as ordinary as mine. His wife had left him for his best friend. The betrayal stung, so he had chosen to walk away, to isolate himself from everything. This house had belonged to his grandfather, who had once worked here as a forest ranger. His voice remained even, neither bitter nor resentful, yet there was something in the way he spoke that made it clear the wound hadn't fully healed. And yet, despite everything, he hadn't let it break him. I watched him, and for the first time in a long while, I felt that I was sitting across from someone who truly understood. A sad smile crept onto my face as I listened. He had somewhere to retreat to, a place to escape, while I had nothing. No backup plan, no safety net, just my son and a road that led to nowhere. As if sensing my thoughts, Dan calmly suggested that we stay. There was more than enough space, and a small village nearby where we could get whatever we needed. I hesitated. The offer was tempting, too tempting, but living without money wasn't sustainable. For now, we were relying on his food, his resources. How long could that last? A week passed, then another. Time moved differently here, steady, almost peaceful. Aiden spent his days playing in the yard, running through the forest, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I could simply breathe. But everything has changed now. We were leaving. When I first met Nick, he seemed perfect, reliable, caring, confident, exactly the kind of man I thought I needed. I was in a difficult situation, fresh out of college, still unemployed, with no place of my own. Some bureaucratic issue had left me without the housing I was supposed to get. Nick became my savior, the one who reached out to me when I needed support the most. I thought he was my guardian angel. I believed that right up until Aiden was born. That was when everything changed. Nick no longer hid his true nature. Words of support turned into mockery. Care transformed into control, and soon, threats and humiliation followed. I tried to justify his behavior, convinced myself that things would get better, that he was just stressed, that it was temporary. I had nowhere to go, no one to help me. But reality eventually caught up with me. One day, I told Dan that this couldn't last forever. We needed to figure out where to go, where to live, and, most importantly, how I could earn a living. We couldn't keep relying on him. He wasn't responsible for us. As I spoke, Aiden kicked his soccer ball across the yard, blissfully unaware of the weight of the conversation. Dan listened without interruption, then, after a brief pause, calmly suggested an alternative, going back to the city together. He had a large apartment with enough space for us, at least while I got back on my feet. It would give me time to find a job and rebuild a life. I froze. Returning to the city meant one thing, the possibility of running into Nick. Dan only shrugged. That was the point. I couldn't spend my life hiding, and Aiden deserved stability, a real childhood, school, friends. I had no answer. The thought of facing my past terrified me, but the idea of running forever terrified me even more. 3 days later, we left. I still wasn't sure if I was making the right choice, but Dan was right. I couldn't keep hiding. I couldn't steal my son's future out of fear of my past. Life in the city slowly began to take shape again. I filed for divorce immediately and found a job soon after. For the first time in years, I felt like I had control over my own life. Dan turned out to be far more well off than I had imagined. He had his own business, a spacious apartment, and a steady routine, but despite living under the same roof, we barely saw each other. He was constantly at work, while I focused on adjusting to a new rhythm, trying to rebuild a sense of normalcy. A month passed. I had just stepped out of the grocery store carrying a bag of fish when a voice stopped me cold. My stomach dropped. I knew that voice. Slowly, I turned around. Nick stood a few steps away, his eyes narrowed, lips curled into a smirk full of contempt. I could see everything in his expression. Anger, a need to punish, a desire to reclaim control. My body tensed, every muscle locking in place. My feet felt glued to the pavement. He started speaking, but I no longer heard the words. His clenched fists, the slow but deliberate step forward. Everything blurred, slowing as if I had fallen into a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. I squeezed my eyes shut, instinctively raising my hands, bracing for impact. But the blow never came. Instead, a sharp, heavy thud cut through the air, followed by a groan. Cautiously, I opened my eyes. Nick was on the ground, and Dan stood over him. His expression was calm, but his eyes were cold, unyielding. He didn't raise his voice, but every word carried a clear warning. If Nick ever came near me or Aiden again, the consequences would be far worse. Nick opened his mouth, maybe to argue, maybe to threaten, but Dan didn't give him the chance. Without a word, he pulled a business card from his pocket and shoved it into Nick's jacket. I'm the one who will protect them. Always," said Dan. His voice was steady, final. There was nothing more to say. Dan silently turned, took the bag from my hands, and gently nudged me toward the building. The gesture was simple, yet it carried everything: care, protection, the quiet reassurance that I was no longer alone. I walked beside him, a faint smile forming on my lips. For the first time in years, something warm spread through me, something almost forgotten: hope, and something else. Something I was afraid to admit, even to myself. I was falling for him. Like a girl experiencing love for the first time, I felt the quiet certainty that, with him, I could finally breathe. At the door, he suddenly stopped, his expression turning serious. His eyes met mine as he asked when my divorce would be finalized. 5 days. I exhaled. He nodded as if calculating something in his mind. Then, without hesitation, he said we needed to get married, that Nick wouldn't back down otherwise, that he would never let me go. His words came quickly, almost rushed, as if he needed me to understand before I could refuse. But I had already made my decision. I stepped closer, the space between us disappearing, and kissed him. He froze, as if unable to believe what was happening, what I was offering. For a brief moment, uncertainty flickered in his eyes, a deeper fear, the kind learned over years of expecting the worst. But the doubt lasted only a second. The bag slipped from his grasp, landing on the pavement, and then his arms were around me, pulling me close, holding me like I might disappear if he let go. In his touch, in the way he held me, was everything: relief, joy, protection. This moment belonged to us. And then came the mistresses. He didn't even bother to hide them. To the outside world, we still looked like the perfect family, but I knew the truth. Today, for the last time, he raised his hand against me. But this time, our son stepped between us. Nick was furious. One swing and Aiden was thrown across the room. Something inside me shattered in that moment. I couldn't wait any longer. I couldn't keep hoping. We were leaving, and no matter how hard he tried to find us, I would make sure he never hurt us again. We stepped out through the gate without looking back. Every second, I expected to hear the sound of his car screeching back into the driveway, to feel his presence behind us. My heart pounded so hard I could barely hear Aiden's footsteps beside me. The bus stop wasn't far, but at the last moment, I changed my mind. If Nick realized we were gone, the first thing he'd do was check security footage and figure out which way we went. We needed to disappear as quickly as possible. We walked to the very edge of the suburban neighborhood until we stumbled upon a familiar trail leading into the woods. Years ago, before Aiden was born, my friends and I had cut through this forest and ended up in a completely different part of town. Back then, the walk took no more than 20 minutes. Now, with a child and heavy bags, it felt endless. But after an hour, we finally emerged, exhausted, out of breath but free. We boarded the first bus we saw, not even checking its destination. The only thing that mattered was getting as far away as possible before the driver checked the tickets. We made it through 4 stops, then switched to another bus, then another. Eventually, we found ourselves standing at an abandoned bus stop. There was no one around, only the occasional car passing in the distance. I overheard 2 passengers talking as they got off with us. Apparently, there was a large village nearby. A 40-minute walk if we took the road, about 15 minutes through the woods. I looked down at Aiden. He was tired, but there was no fear in his eyes, only trust. We had taken the first step toward freedom. Now we just had to figure out where to go next. Gripping his small hand, I turned toward the forest. My legs ached, the straps of the bag dug into my shoulders, making it feel impossibly heavy. What once seemed light now felt like a burden of stone. We needed shelter, somewhere to rest for the night. Only then could I think about what came next. At first the path seemed easy, the trail was clear, and the forest wasn't too dense. Aiden chattered nonstop, pointing out birds, spotting squirrels, suddenly recalling memories that made him laugh. I played along, responding, smiling, trying to keep his spirits up. But at some point I realized the trail had disappeared. His voice held a slight tremor when he asked if we were lost. I reassured him, forcing my own voice to stay steady, even as unease settled deep inside me. The trees grew taller, their trunks denser, and the sunlight slipped lower with each passing minute. The deeper we went, the more a quiet alarm rang in my mind. What if we had to spend the night out here? Then, just as panic began creeping in, the trees thinned, opening into a small clearing. A house stood there, sturdy, well-built, yet seemingly abandoned. Who would build a house in a place like this? There was no time for hesitation. We had no other option. Approaching cautiously, I scanned the windows and door, no signs of life. Inside, the space felt strange, empty, yet not neglected. As if no one had lived here in years, but someone had still taken care of it. I made a silent decision. We wouldn't touch anything. If this place had an owner, we would leave at first light. For now, we just needed one safe, warm night. We had dinner with the little food I had managed to grab from home, and Aiden quickly fell asleep, curled up on an old couch. I lay awake for a long time, staring at the dark ceiling, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the night. The creaking of wood, the rustling outside, even my own breathing felt too loud in the silence. When sleep finally took me, it was restless. Something unsettling filled my dreams, though when I woke, the details had already slipped away. But the fear remained, and this time, it wasn't from a dream. A sound, sharp, real. I froze, my heart pounding violently in my chest. The refrigerator. I had seen it earlier in the kitchen, old, rusted, looking like it had been there for decades. But now, a faint light seeped through the doorway, and the sound of the fridge door opening was unmistakable. I hadn't even realized this house had electricity. Had there been power lines leading here? I had been too distracted to notice. My breath hitched as I turned my head slowly toward Aiden. He was still asleep, undisturbed. But we were not alone. What should I do? If I tried to leave, I might be seen. If I stayed, whoever was in the kitchen would eventually realize they weren't alone. There was only one option left: talk, negotiate, convince them to let us go. My legs felt weak as I stood, fear making every movement sluggish. I glanced at Aiden again, my chest tightening. What if this person was dangerous? But there was no other choice. At that moment, the kitchen door swung open abruptly, flooding the room with light. I squeezed my eyes shut for a second, releasing a shaky breath before forcing myself to speak. "I'm sorry. We thought the house was abandoned. We just needed a place for the night. We meant no harm. We'll leave as soon as the sun comes up." A figure stood in the doorway, tall, broad, with a thick beard and unkempt hair. His expression was heavy, guarded but not immediately hostile. His gaze flickered toward Aiden, still fast asleep, then back to me before he motioned toward the kitchen. Fear gripped me, making every step feel heavier. I hesitated for just a second, looking back at my son before forcing myself forward. It felt like walking to my own execution. Noticing my tension, the man gave the faintest smirk before pulling the door almost shut behind us, leaving just enough space for me to keep an eye on Aiden.